Canada and Australia, they get new cancer drugs 6 months to a year later than us. So how are we going to avoid that? Why are we throwing away that advantage? And that's not all the European Medicines Agency do. They have particularly directed research into rare diseases, and particularly for children. Now, if you're dealing with rare congenital conditions, in Scotland or even in the UK, you would struggle to have enough young people to study to get an answer. Out of a population of 500 million, with researchers working together right across Europe, we have made more progress in treating rare childhood conditions in the last decade than in multiple decades before. And a lot of that was through the drive of the European Medicines Agency. Now, they also keep up what's called pharmacovigilance, so looking for things that are going wrong with drugs. We're going to be outside that. We're going to be outside other agencies like the European Chemicals Agency. How's that going to work? We're going to not have access to their database. We're also looking at what will happen with drugs at the border. Now, you've heard all the scare stories about no deal, and we might have issues with getting drugs in and out. There will be issues. It will be slower. We will have to support and store more drugs, but where are we going to keep them? So we're expecting pharmaceutical firms to build bigger warehouses. One of the announcements the government made in the summer was pharmacies should increase their storage space. Have you been into your local pharmacy? It looks like my loft. You're asking all of these businesses to suddenly build an extension so that they can stockpile more drugs. Now, the pharmaceutical firms in the UK are increasing that. They're going from either 6 weeks or 10 weeks up to 12 or 14 weeks. Now, if it's just that everything moves a wee bit slower, then that might give us enough of a cushion. If we actually just go right off the cliff with a no deal and we're not moving anything, we're going to run through that pretty darn quickly. And the problem is, it isn't just with a no deal that things will be slow at the border. That will also affect if we end up with Boris's solution, a Canada deal. You're still talking about impact at the border. So we will have issues of supply and flow, and that will happen with any of their chosen outcomes. There's no talk about the fact that the EU is the biggest research network in the world, bigger than China, bigger than America. Now, some of its funding, through programs like Horizon 2020, there's been fantastic funding to our universities, to our businesses, to our pharmaceutical industries. But the most important thing is actually the collaboration. The top quality research isn't just one group of researchers in Scotland or one group in the UK. It is literally multi-country, working together right across Europe. And the problem is, a lot of that comes down to the funding, to the administration, to freedom of movement. To be able to ring someone up and say, I can't get that experiment to work. Oh, don't worry, I'll be on Ryanair at 10 o'clock in the morning and we'll get it sorted. Oh, no, I can't. I have to apply for a visa. Freedom of movement allows us to actually work together. And what was completely overlooked in the Brexit debate was that freedom of movement works both ways. It's not just immigrants like my husband coming here. It's the fact that my son did Erasmus in Berlin for a year. It's the fact that many of you may have children or young people in your families who are working across Europe. And suddenly, for the next generation, we're taking that away from them. And the other aspect is the public health. It has often been legislation from Europe that has driven us to clean up our water, to clean up our beaches, to get rid of the acid rain that was burning all our forests. And it was the EU that was threatening to take the UK government to court last year to try and get them to tackle the air pollution, which is killing 40,000 people a year. Now, when I tried to walk to work in London, from about the midway point onwards, I'm just coughing and coughing and coughing because the air is just horrible. And there are children in London with asthma. There are people who are dying because of the pollution. And yet, there's not the interest in fixing it. So there has been this pressure that has come from the EU, which people might go, oh, all the bureaucracy. You look at the proposals that are coming forward from the Conservatives for post-Brexit anything, and then talk about bureaucracy. Like the European Medicines Agency, You had one agency for Europe. This reduced bureaucracy. And what they're talking about to try and patch up their chaos is increased bureaucracy. And then on top of that, obviously in Scotland, we've got a particular problem because Brexit is being used to undermine devolution and 20 years of devolution in our parliament. Now, they won't shut it. There's people who say, oh, they could shut our parliament down. They're not stupid. They would never do anything that overt, but they will hollow it out from the inside. And that's exactly what will happen with the power grab. 24 powers where the ultimate decision level will not come from Europe to here, even though it's over devolved competencies, but will be re-reserved to Westminster. Now people say, well, you never had that power. That power was in Europe. But the drive in Europe is about creating a level playing field. You know, when people say, oh, it's very dry, it's very legalistic, it's to try and avoid any misinterpretation. Everything is written out, everything is translated into 27 languages. Exact wording is something they pay a lot of attention to make sure that the playing field is level. Unfortunately, in the UK, we know the playing field isn't remotely level. And the power grab is about making it even less level. What the Scottish Government was fighting for was accepting that these 24 areas needed some kind of agreement on how are we going to do this. Farming, fishing, subsidy, rural development, etc. We need some kind of framework to agree what we're going to do. But it was that word agree. All the Scottish Government were saying is these should be agreed. But Westminster wouldn't have that. Westminster was determined that they can impose them. And that's the outcome at the moment. And that's what we were promised to debate on 4 times by David Mundell, that we would get to debate and amend their power grab. And when it was going away to the Lords, I pointed out we don't take seats in the Lords. We don't believe in the House of Lords. And unlike the Liberals, who also apparently don't believe in the House of Lords, we actually just don't take seats there. So that meant Scotland's governing party was not going to be represented at the point that they were finally going to lay their amendments to the power grab. But it wasn't just that we would be excluded. No elected member from Scotland of any party would be part of that debate when the government finally laid their amendments to the power grab. Oh, don't you worry, when it comes back to the House of Commons, there'll be plenty of time to debate and amend it. 15 minutes, all of it used by the minister. Not one Scottish MP got to speak about the power grab. Our points of order went on 4 times longer than the debate that night. And then people wonder why we ended up walking out of the Parliament the next day. The power grab is to create an even more unlevel playing field. You have to remember that when you look at these powers, environment, agriculture, fishing, food safety, food standards, food labelling, it's all about selling Scotland to America to get a trade deal. And one of the things that America's really against is geographical indicators. So Scotch beef, Scotch lamb, Scotch whiskey. They demand that they will be able to sell American whiskey as Scotch. That is one of their absolute prerequisites for a trade deal. But now Westminster controls food labelling. So we have the discussion at the moment, keep Scotland the brand. Well, just watch that disappear over the cliff when this goes forward. Because this will all be about getting a trade deal with Trump. And while I and many others had concerns about TTIP, a Tory-Trump trade deal is way more scary because there'll be no control, there'll be no checks and balances in it whatsoever. And the thing is, for any of these are devolved competencies that we're talking about. So in discussions round the table of the 4 nations, the UK government will be negotiating on behalf of England. But at any point, they can stand up and say, enough already. This is what we're doing, because we're also the UK government. So this is absolutely not a level playing field. I mean, just a wee example, this is not health related, but looking at agriculture. And Michael Gove has said that he thinks there shouldn't be direct subsidies for farmers. They'll support people who are doing extra environmental things, they'll support certain projects, but there shouldn't be direct subsidy of farming. Now that's all right for him to say, because in England, only 17% of the land is classed as less favoured area. In Scotland, it's over 80%. In Wales, it's over 80%. In Northern Ireland, it's over 70%. So you look at that situation, that's fine. They're sitting there thinking, well, we can afford not to subsidise because we're looking at big agri-businesses in the south of England. How are our sheep farmers going to survive that? What's going to happen to our agriculture? And that's what we have to realise, that they will be negotiating what suits England, and they will have the power at any point to say, this is how it's going to be. And that is really concerning. If you're anxious about GM crops, if you're anxious about fracking, if you're anxious about what's going to happen to our NHS in the future. Because one of the powers that I'm very concerned about and I've been trying to draw attention to is that hidden way down at the bottom of the list is public procurement. Now, people in Scotland, not everybody supports independence. We're all well aware of that. But the vast majority support devolution. Because most people recognise the benefits they've had. Free childcare, tuition, prescriptions, free personal care for older citizens. And the fact that we still have a united public NHS. Now, the NHS in England has been torn apart because of the Health and Social Care Act. And Section 75 of that Act says that all NHS contracts that can be put out to tender must be put out to tender between the private sector and the NHS. And that's also between the NHS. You've actually got NHS trusts competing with each other, as well as competing with Virgin Care. So this has caused terrible fragmentation. It is no longer a collaborative system. It's a competitive system. And if you talk to nurses and doctors that you know south of the border, they will tell you it is tearing NHS England apart. Now, it is such an issue that when 6 commissioning groups in Surrey tried to bring services back into the NHS, now they weren't breaking a contract with Virgin. The contract was coming to an end, and they just simply realised, actually, we should bring this back in-house. This should be delivered by the NHS. And Virgin sued them. And they sued all 6 CCGs. Now, they won't reveal how much they paid, but one of them paid well over 300,000. So we're talking at least £2 million that went into the pockets of Virgin, because that's their modus operandi. Do you remember when they lost the franchise in the railways? Sue you. That's what they do. So all the UK government have to do is stand up and say, from now on, all public services, all contracts must be put out to tender. They have the ultimate power. Now, we don't know if they're going to want to do that. We might hope they wouldn't. But do we really want that someone else has the power to do that to us? I find that really frightening. And a lot of journalists have not been talking about it because it sounds kind of dry. They know what agriculture and fishing is, public procurement, small print. But it's not. It's one of the most frightening powers that would be taken away from us. So to me, I think it is critical that we start looking at the future that we want, that we recognise from how Scotland has been treated over the last 2 years, the utter contempt that has been shown for Scotland and how we voted, that we start looking at where do we want to go in the future. Because if we were independent, we could protect our parliament. We can decide to be in the EU or the EEA, whatever the decision is. And we can also reject the austerity and poverty politics that is coming out of Westminster and impacting every one of our communities, driving up the number of children growing up in poverty. 1 in 5 people in Scotland are living in poverty. With children, it's 1 in 4. It's a quarter of all of our children growing up in poverty. And yet, Scotland has the lowest poverty rates in the UK. Would you believe that? Now, we know that we've had poverty issues for decades, and yet, of the 4 nations, we have the lowest poverty rates. And that's because the Scottish Government is pouring money in, trying to mitigate the cuts that have